right, is everyone in? I think so. So we'll begin. All right. So good afternoon to everyone who's joining us tonight, and thank you so much for taking the time to partake in this session with Qing Ren as she talks about her dissertation research in environmental justice and its intersection with geospatial technologies, and particularly looking at using spatial data to understand environmental disparities in Vermont. And Qing Ren is a PhD candidate in UVM's Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources, and I'll pass it off to her in one moment, but just a few logistical pieces first before I pass it off. So I'm Claire Goodwin. I work for continuing and distance education at UVM, and I'm going to be monitoring the chat. So we encourage you to ask your questions at any point during Qing's presentation, and I will make sure to pass those along throughout the presentation. And then we'll also save some time at the end for you to ask questions if you want to wait. Also that this is being recorded, so if you have registered for this session, we will send a follow-up email with some post-session materials as well as the recording. And if you don't know if you have registered for this and would like the recording, you can shoot us an email at learn@uvm.edu, and we'll make sure to send that to you as well. Qing has also shared some files, and you can see them between the chat and the video. And you can download those by clicking the down arrow when you hover over the PDF. So without further ado, I will mute myself and pass it off to Qing. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for the nice introduction and also the logistics. And welcome, everyone. It's nice to see you all joining me tonight. And as Claire introduced, my name is Qing Ren. I'm in the PhD program of Natural Resources at the Rubenstein School of UVM. And tonight, I'd like to share with you part of my dissertation research on using spatial data and a GIS approach to learn about environmental justice in Vermont. By the way, I will use, you will hear me using the acronym EJ for environmental justice just for convenience. So let's look at the outline of our webinar tonight. And I will do a short introduction first, and we will very quickly go over the origin and some definitions of EJ. And then we will briefly talk about the general applications of GIS in EJ research. And then we're going to spend a little bit more time to talk about the Vermont Environmental Disparity Index, VTEDI. And this is the example of using spatial data in EJ studies. And at last, we will also talk about the implications of using the index in decision making and the limitations of using spatial data in EJ research. And all of my presentation should take about 35 to 40 minutes. I'll try to keep it within 40 minutes, and hopefully we will have some time for questions and discussions in the end. And as Claire said, if you have any questions, please feel free to type the questions in the chat anytime. And if there's a question that might take a little bit longer to answer or to talk about, and we can save those for later as well. Any questions so far? Okay, no one is typing in questions, so I'll just start. And yeah, I want to share with you a little bit about how I got very interested in studying EJ. And when I started my PhD program with my advisor, Bindu Paniker, and she was part of the initiative named Rejoice, and that's a acronym for Rural Environmental Justice Opportunities Informed by Community Expertise. It's a very, very long name. That's why we use Rejoice for short. And the goal of this initiative is to work toward introducing an EJ bill in Vermont that would eventually lead to an EJ policy. Vermont is one of the few states that still do not have an EJ policy, and so this group's goal is to work toward getting a policy in place. And the UVM team has been part of the research core of the Rejoice project. So starting in 2019, we've done some door-to-door surveys in several vulnerable communities of the state, and I was one of the data collectors during the survey. So in the summer of 2019, we spent several months knocking on people's doors and asking them questions, and people were very generous to us, and they not only answered our questions on the questionnaire, and they also just opened up to us and share their stories and their concerns about their communities, and they just share their life stories with us, and I felt really touched by that experience. So I got interested in learning more about EJ in the state, and so later on, I started working on this mapping project, but that experience really inspired me to learn a little bit more about EJ. And this picture of a little flower here, this was we were not really taking pictures of our respondents during the survey, but like when I was talking to this family in a trailer park for a long time, and then their daughter, like who was 14 years old, who had Lyme disease and some other health conditions, and she was very nice to me. Then, but in the end, she gave me a little flower, and I thought that was very nice of her. So that was about the only picture that I took during the entire survey, and I just put it here. And so, well, obviously, all of you who signed up for the webinar are very interested in EJ, and I know that a lot of you also already have knowledge and understanding of EJ. So we have a little poll here that is some interactive thing that we can do before we get started. And the question is, which of these aspects are within the scope of EJ and EJ movement and research? And you can choose multiple options if you like. It should be on the screen right now, and you can just click the boxes.
Look at those answers.
Yeah. Yeah, this is great, and everyone did very well. So obviously, it's kind of obvious that all of these are parts of EJ, and some of them are about distribution, some of them are about recognition or capability building or procedure, and we're going to talk about these dimensions in a minute. But thank you for doing this exercise with me. And here's a very, very brief story about the origin of EJ. And let's just go back to the 1980s. And a lot of you probably already know about Warren County. And this is a rural and low income, mostly Black county in North Carolina. And in the 1980s, I think in 1982, the state government of North Carolina decided to dump about 6,000 truckloads of soil that contaminated by toxic PCBs to the in a landfill in the county. So PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, and are a group of man-made chemicals that can cause cancer and some other health issues. So the community didn't really agree with this action. So they organized to protest against the dumping of the toxic soil. In this picture here, you can see some protesters sitting in front of this truck loaded with PCB soil. And this is one of the iconic pictures in the history of EJ. And their actions drew a lot of attention nationwide from media and also other areas with similar issues. But the communities actually eventually lost their case despite a tremendous amount of efforts. The state government ended up dumping the waste in a proposed site anyway, but because of their activism, the government also made some compromises. They promised that they would not to dump more toxic waste in the county, and they also promised that they would clean it up as soon as the resources became available. And so So Warren County is largely considered as a starting point of EJ movement. And after Warren County, other communities of color, especially in the South, started fighting against the siting of polluting facilities in their areas. Um, so in 1994, President Bill Clinton signed an executive order to require all federal agencies to integrate the goal of EJ in their work. That was an important point or milestone of EJ, and we really don't have time for a longer version of the history, but there is a resource that you can look at, which is the EJ timeline on EPA's website, and that link is included in that Word document in the file box, also the pre-session materials. And it's a pretty cool timeline that marks all of the important events and milestones of EJ. So yeah, so there are a lot of definitions of EJ. People debate on what the definition should be, and different agencies, different scholars might have different ideas about what EJ is. And the EPA's official definition is here. It's basically saying that all groups, regardless of your identity and socioeconomic status, should be treated not equally, but equitably in environmental decision making. But I think there are a lot more dimensions and than just this like very official definition. And one of the concepts or frameworks that I really like was proposed by David Glassberg, and he looks at EJ through these four dimensions: distribution, recognition, capabilities, and procedural justice. And just because when people talk about EJ, especially when you're talking about like environmental burdens, risks, and we're talking about distribution a lot. So distribution of could be risks or could be benefits across socioeconomic groups. But the other dimensions are a lot of times ignored, like recognition, capabilities. And recognition means respect and recognize the identities of all communities. And also capabilities would be help the communities to kind of generate knowledge, to learn about and address environmental issues. And also procedural justice to engage voices and the leadership of traditionally marginalized populations, such as people of color. So these are all pretty important dimensions of EJ that sometimes get overlooked. And so talking about spatial analysis, and spatial analysis has been an important tool in EJ research from the beginning. And some of the earliest studies, like the one conducted by the General Accounting Office, which is this one on the left, and also this one on the right, was conducted by the United Church of Christ. And these were both done in the 1980s. And these are some of the earliest spatial studies that showed race was the most important defining factor in the location of toxic waste facilities in the United States. And these early studies, actually in the earlier years of EJ movement, the scope of EJ was mostly about pollution and also health risk. But later on, the scope of EJ was kind of expanded to include more aspects of the environment. And now it's really like a very broad concept that could include a very diverse kind of set of goals, and include food, energy, housing, transportation, and even recreation spaces. So, and spatial analysis related to these areas, such as like transportation justice, energy justice, food justice, have also emerged as part of the EJ research. And another thing that people realized was that EJ is not something that stands alone. It really intercepts with a lot of inequalities. For example, social vulnerability could make people more sensitive to environmental hazards. And for communities with less resources, they could be, oppressed by structural racism. They could have lower income. So the social vulnerability and environmental issues can cause multi-layered harms to people. So using maps to overlay these factors on top of each other really can help us to understand how these factors interact and pose a double or even sometimes triple jeopardy on the vulnerable communities. And so, as I mentioned, that Vermont is one of the states that have not adopted an EJ policy, and not all states are equally motivated to have an EJ policy. And studies have shown that some factors might contribute to the decision or motivation of adopting an EJ policy, like a high racial diversity, having a strong environmental interest group, or having severe environmental problems, and also a more liberal government could be some of the contributing factors for adopting EJ policy. And also, a lot of EJ studies really focus on, or EJ work has focused on a lot on like metropolitan urban areas, and studies on rural areas are still relatively rare or not a priority in EJ studies. So based on this background, it's not really hard to see some of the reasons why Vermont still doesn't have EJ policy. This is a very white state, and it's largely rural, and we don't have a lot of a lot of severe environmental issues, and we do have a relatively liberal government, but the state agencies at this moment are still kind of in their early stages to figure out how to incorporate EJ in their work. And so, many other state governments, not Vermont, but many other state governments have used the mapping as a tool to inform their environmental decision making and also the development of policies. And so in the pre-session materials, so you could see the links of some examples of these maps. So this one here on the slide is the Washington map, and I believe there's a link to the California map, and some other states like Maryland, North Carolina also have their own maps. And Vermont Law School, who's also a part of the Rejoice initiative, they have done some research, and they told us that 24 states now have developed some kind of EJ map, and I haven't really seen them all, but it's no doubt that this mapping approach has been a very useful tool for the state governments, especially that a lot of you probably know about EJ Screen, which is the EJ tool developed by the EPA. EJ Screen is pretty cool. It has a lot of different layers in there for the whole nation, but sometimes it's also limited that you cannot really overlay layers on top of each other, so you don't see how these data sets overlap or how they interact. So these state level maps are more focused, and they can also show, because based on like more sophisticated calculation and a model building, then they can show a more integrated result for a state or a neighborhood that you're interested in. Yeah, so for Vermont, and the DEC signed this performance agreement plan with the EPA, which requires the Vermont DEC to develop the EJ policy in order to receive the EJ-related fundings from the EPA in the future. So the state agencies have been very motivated to work with external partners such as Rejoice to develop these tools and eventually have a policy in place, because they already signed this agreement plan with the EPA. So yeah, in 2019, because of all of this work, we started to put a map together to identify the Vermont communities that have the highest cumulative impact of social and environmental burdens. And there has been multiple iterations of this mapping process. So in the beginning, one of Bindu's graduate students, Walter Cady, and he started to gather some existing data and put together an earlier version of this map. And I helped in the process, but I was not heavily involved. And the index back then had fewer variables and some environmental hazard variables, and also socioeconomic variables were just like race and income, I think. Maybe gender was in there, but I can't remember for sure. It was not a lot. But after Walter graduated, I kind of just took over the project and started to build a second version. And later, Professor Jillian Goffard also joined us and joined my committee, and she helped us to conduct a more correlation analysis between the variables in the map. So in this new version, we have more environmental variables, and we also decided to use the Vermont Social Vulnerability Index, which was developed by the Department of Health for the social to show to as the social vulnerability component in our index, because it already has a lot of socioeconomic variables measures in there. And so that's very like a very good existing data set that we could use. And we also added health risk variables in there. And so by the end of last year, we had a second version that we presented this version and some preliminary findings from our correlation analysis to the DEC. We had a pretty big meeting. The DEC commissioner was there, and people from different divisions of the DEC also joined, and they provided some ideas about getting like additional data sets for the map. And I did follow up with about five, six, or seven, I can't remember, these divisions and programs. And some of the data sets that they suggested didn't really work out, but two of them turned out to be like a great addition to the map, like lead in school drinking water and also impaired surface water, this one here. And so we added these variables, and we have the third version of the map. And Claire, could you please put a link in the chat so people can have that right now? So if you click on the, I can't see the, yeah. So if you click on the link that Claire just shared, that's the third version of our map. And I will talk more about the data sources and details in a minute. And here I just want to show you like the three big components of our index here. So we have the social vulnerability, we have the environmental risk, we have the health risk, and we put the three together as a final index. And I do have a slide that will show the calculation of the index, and here is just like the overall structure. And so in the earlier stage of mapping, we debated what kind of analysis unit that we should use for the map. And we decided, like in the end, we decided to use census tract just because the social vulnerability index used this unit, and also some other data sets also were available at this level. So we thought it would be convenient for us to just use this unit. But it turned out along the way, we kind of figured out, okay, there are pros and cons of using census tract. And obviously, some of the variables were available, readily available at this level. And but there were also some shortcomings. I think one of the biggest things is that the resolution is not very high, and especially for less populated areas. So you still don't have a very detailed look at some of the really like small neighborhoods, but you have a general idea of the whole state, but the resolution is not that high. And another thing is that it doesn't really conform with town boundaries. And in Vermont, people are really used to see town boundaries. Like when they look at a map, they want to see, okay, where's my town? And I want to see where my town is, because town is really like a significant geospatial unit in Vermont. So we kind of, census tracts are more concentrated in populated areas. Burlington probably has 10 census tracts. But if you go to the Northeast Kingdom, one census tract could be huge, and that can have 5, 6, 7, 8 towns in there. So in the web app, we if you click on a tract, you can see that we did add the town names associated with the tract, which kind of resolved this issue, but it's not an ideal way. So yeah, so the units is definitely something that you have to consider when you're making a map of this sort, and that has a lot of implications on how you interpret the results and how you present the results and how you work with your stakeholders to kind of understand why you use this unit. And here on the slide, it's kind of hard to read. It is included in the paper that I shared in the file box, so you don't really have to read the fine prints here. I just want to point out that for the environmental risk factors, we have largely two kinds of data sources, and one was the federal agencies. For example, this traffic noise data set came from the Department of Transportation, and they have this map or this data set for traffic noise. And some other state agencies like the EPA and also FEMA, they have map or data sets that we can use for some of the environmental hazard variables. And the other main source of data was at the state level. And some of the data sets, we could just download them from the Vermont Geospatial data portal. And but some of them, we actually got the data sets directly from the state, from the state. Like this one, lead in school drinking water, is a really cool data set that the Department of Health and Agency of Natural Resources actually went out to all of the K-12 schools and daycares in Vermont to sample their drinking water. And that was an excellent addition to our map here. And for the health risk factors, we ended up using this BRFSS dataset, and I call it breakfast. It's easier to say it that way. And breakfast is actually a national phone survey based data like pool. It's every state has its own breakfast survey, operates its own breakfast survey. It's a phone survey data, so it's not really ideal, but their method is very consistent and solid, so it still provides some good results. And it turned out to be very difficult to get health data. That was probably one of the more challenging points of getting data, because usually data sources are very protective of their data just because of privacy issues. And we worked with the medical center, we contacted the Department of Health, and we tried multiple sources like insurance data, hospital data, and it turned out that people don't want you to be able to locate or narrow down to a very small area, and there are so few data sets that you could almost tell who those data points are. So a lot of the health data sets come in very coarse resolution, like either county or even state, and you really don't have a great resolution for that. And the breakfast data came in sub-county level, so we thought that was the best that we could get in that scenario. So we ended up using five indicators in there, and based on research, and these are some of the indicators that can make people more vulnerable to the adverse effects of the environmental pollution. And I already talked about the social vulnerability index. It's a pretty cool resource, and you could just search Vermont social vulnerability index, and you're going to see this web page put together by the Vermont Department of Health, and it does show a lot of different variables in there, and population characteristics and socioeconomic status, and other than, sorry, this is going all over the place. And so other than the variables in the SVI, we also added two food-related variables, which are, one is food access and the other one is the use of food stamps, and both of them are also economic indicators. So here comes to the calculation part. It might sound a little convoluted. The calculation itself is really not that complicated, but when I put this together, I was amazed by how hard it is to explain this verbally, but I'll try my best. So for each census tract, and we have a lot of variables in each of the three components, and so for every component we normalize. This is not right. I meant to write for each component. We normalized all of the variables using the percentile rank between 0 and 100. And then for each of the three big components, we took an average percentile rank of all of the variables in that component. And this gives us a score of a single component. And then we put the three together using this formula here. And this formula here is basically just like adjusting the weights of the environmental exposure and the other two components. And we assign a 100% weight to environmental exposure and a 50% weight to health risk and social vulnerabilities, because we want to focus more on environmental exposure. So the other two wouldn't outweigh environmental exposure. And so it's actually just a product of environmental exposure score and the weighted sum of health risk and social vulnerability scores. It's not complicated at all. It's just hard to really explain verbally. And then in the end, we created some maps. Of course, it's a spatial study, so we created some maps. And we have a map for environmental risk. We have a map for social vulnerability. We also have a map for health risk. And also, of course, we have a map for the final index value. And here I'm only showing the two layers or two maps that are included in the web app, which is the link that Claire shared in the chat. So you can see, like, this one on the left is the environmental exposure or environmental hazard. And the one on the right is the final index. And you could see the pattern, the clusters. By the way, darkest colors are the highest risk or highest cumulative impact. And you could see the patterns kind of shifted a little bit. They're similar, but there are also differences in terms of where the most vulnerable areas are. So some of the areas might have like a moderate or like moderately high environmental risk, but adding the social vulnerability and health factor they turned out to be in the highest quantile. So it is still slightly different. And so this slide here this is a heat map or a heat table of the the census tracts in the highest quantile of the index score. They are grouped by counties, and there are 9 counties here. And so there are 3 rows here: social, health, and the environmental. And you can see some of the census tracts have very high scores across the 3 rows, and some of them might have like dark color in 1 or 2 of the categories. So even with the highest risk towns, you still see some differences in terms of where their priorities are. And so I think this is something that if you're trying to prioritize resources, is something that you should consider. And by the way, in the paper, we didn't include the top part of this table, and we don't want to really pinpoint to a specific census tract, and we're just showing the results by counties, which is a more generalized way to present the results. And so this was suggested by Jillian, and she just suggested to overlay the original index with population density. And the one on the left is the original index score, and the one in the middle is the index score multiplied by population density for each census tract. And this one on the right is the index score multiplied by the population density of people of color. So this is for when the scenario where you have limited resources, but you want to serve a maximum number of people, or you want to serve a maximum number of people of color. So you can refer to these maps to identify where you should go or where you should prioritize to serve the maximum population. And yeah, so there are some limitations of using the way, our approach and the data sources. And one of them I already talked about a little bit. So data sources and availability. Availability is really challenging, is a challenging issue, and we are trying to find data sources, and sometimes you have to be open to to kind of accept the fact that you can't really access some of the things that you really want to have, and also you have to be flexible in terms of utilizing different data sources and how you put them together. And sometimes you might need to use proxies for some of the data sets that you cannot get. So this is something this is a part of the more challenging part of the study. And also choosing the scale of analysis, and I also already talked about it. And there are pros and cons to each scale that you might choose. And I think it's really important to recognize the limitations of using a certain scale, and be aware of how you interpret the results based on the scale that you choose. And another thing that I realized along the way is that different stakeholders have different needs in terms of mapping and spatial results, because we developed this map because we wanted to see like the overall pattern for the whole state. And so we chose this unit of analysis, and we also chose this approach to kind of show the whole state and where the priority areas are. But with this approach, it's very hard to see where the very detailed information for a neighborhood. So for state agencies, when they're trying to allocate resources, they might want to see the whole state just because they want to know where they should go to, and they have the whole state in mind. But if I live in a neighborhood where there are some pollution sources or some other issues, and I want to really know what's going on in my neighborhood, and so this approach obviously will not work. So this shows that collaborating with your target audience and also the communities is very important in the process. It is very difficult, and it's resource consuming as well. So for our mapping approach, we didn't really do that, but a collaborative mapping approach would be valuable in community work as well. And that could be part of the next steps, that taking this first version of the index, and maybe the next step could be one of the next steps could be working more closely with the community. And also right now we're trying to work with the state to move this map to the state server, and they have some internal processes that they have to figure out how to host this in a more sustainable way, so they can get this updated periodically or regularly, so it doesn't end up in the dustbin, like people don't look at it anymore after a year. And so hopefully we can work this out and move it to the state's website. And also, some state departments and agencies suggest that we could have different maps for different programs. Like we could have one for the Clean Water Initiative. We could have one that focuses on transportation justice, or even climate resilience related to these communities. And I was just telling Claire before the session that a couple of days ago, I got an email from a biologist from the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and he told us that he was going to include our index in his grant writing, and he's applying for an EPA grant that could potentially help them to, if they get the grant, they will prioritize the most vulnerable communities to inventory their wetlands for future conservation projects. And I think this is what I have so far, and hopefully we still have like about 11 minutes to, ask questions or have some conversations and discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Ching. I guess if anyone else wants to type their question into the chat, but I have a question in the meantime. And really, really fascinating work. Not my field, but I can see why this is so important for everyone to just kind of have a deeper understanding of it and how it impacts all of us. So at the end, you mentioned this collaborative approach, and so I was curious if there are other states that have developed these environmental disparity indices, and if there's some sort of like interstate collaboration that you know of that's occurring using this data as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't really know if there's any formal. I mean, there's a lot of conversation between the states who are either um, developing a map or they are trying to figure out how to incorporate EJ in their work. There's a lot of official and unofficial conversations. I know, students from Yale Law School, not Yale Law School. I mean, from Yale, like I think the Yale Forestry School. They reached out to us and wanted to learn about our mapping because they were doing a similar report for their state agencies. And also, and I when I was meeting with a person from the DEC, and she mentioned that she talked to the state like equivalent department there in Michigan to ask them how they collaborate with academic partners to develop a map and similar tools to figure out priorities. And so I think it'd be a nice idea, for example, like the New England states, for example, could form some sort of alliance. And I know um, there are some other similar sort of networks for the EJ work, but not specifically for mapping. One of the good examples that I saw was the New York mapping, which is organized by Cornell University. So they have invited partners from other states to participate in their session and to ask for feedbacks and to share resources with people in other states. And they also put together a really good resource inventory for people who are interested in EJ maps, and that does not only include New York specific data, and it also includes many other states and also national level data sets as well.
Amelia has a question, which is what were the main environmental factors that caused areas of Vermont to have a higher index? Is it pollution or access to food, etc.?
Yeah, so in our analysis, we didn't include food as the environmental variables. We use it as an economic indicator. So it's really hard to tell if that's going to change the results. But let me go back to this. So in the environmental risk section, and you can see that all of the variables that we have here, traffic noise, air pollution, polluting sites, impaired surface water, lead in school drinking water, flood zone, and heat vulnerability. And actually, I was also interested in this question. I don't think I have a formal result on this, but I think I did a little bit of exploring in the data set. I also wanted to see which one was the more prominent. I think, if I remember correctly, air pollution and traffic noise were two of the more prominent or unevenly distributed issues. But I would say there was a lot of a lot of like variable results in school drinking water as well, just because you see these clusters of older houses, and that could affect their drinking water quality. And they're all like prominent in different ways. Like for flood hazard zone, you have these areas along the river corridor so you might not have that might be that for the state, the entire state, it might not be that prominent of an issue, but for the communities along the river corridor, that could be a prominent issue. So at different scales, that's different. But I think statewide, the traffic noise and air pollution were driving the scores a lot.
Well, I don't see Amelia says thanks, and I don't see any other questions in the chat. I don't know if anyone else wanted to write something quickly, or Qing, if you wanted to share anything else in our last minute together.
Well, I think this is a really great to have all of you here, which is a good opportunity for me to share the study as well, because we submitted a paper on this. It's not published yet, and so at this moment, it's really great to have an opportunity to share it with more people. So if you know of a way that you could, share this index with more people of in your circle, and you know of a way that could potentially use the index to in different applications, and just feel free to email me or let me know. Um, I'm going to put my email address in the chat. So yeah, and feel free to shoot me an email after the session. And I saw that Jillian mentioned, can you mention your background in GIS prior to this project? So I did, well, I took a GIS course, obviously. Then I did some analysis for environmental behavior study in Vermont. And we had a project that looked at stormwater runoff and people's behaviors of adopting green stormwater infrastructure in Vermont, and did some spatial analysis for that. I also did some unofficial studies of endangered species, some endangered bird species, like blue-wing and golden-wing warblers and their habitats in Vermont. That was just, to help with like some private projects that people were interested in. So actually, it's not like my main focus is not really in spatial analysis, but I'm really interested in using GIS to learn about environmental behavior. And so my main focus in the past 15 years has been environmental education and environmental behavior. So I see this future direction of using a mixed method, including spatial analysis, and to understand a question from multiple dimensions or multiple aspects. And I think it really in the future makes the method approach and also participatory mapping and some other possibilities to apply GIS in the social science work will be a very interesting direction to go to.
Much for sharing your research with us, Qing Ren, and yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming too.
Oh, just a second. Matt typed the question, there a way of integrating distribution of environmental benefits as well? Yes, Matt, I was thinking about that. I actually had that in the first version of what I conceived for the index, but eventually we dropped that for a variable for a lot of different reasons. And I think we wanted to focus on environmental risk in this version of the map, but also it was difficult actually to get good quality data for environmental benefits for the whole state. And you can have some proxies like fishing access or recreational spaces. It's not really great quality of data that covers the entire state. And so I think we had some difficulties in that regard. And also I talked to Bindu, and she wanted to focus on environmental risk because her realm is also more in the environmental risk and health, public health direction. So we ended up not having that, but that is a great aspect to be included.
So John says, thank you for sharing your work. Super interesting and useful to us Vermonters. And then Beverly has a question, which is, if traffic noise is a factor, what about airport noise? Airport noise, is it a big factor for those in line of the F-35s? And I was thinking about that question too.
Yeah, so then this one on this slide, I don't know if we can still see it. The National Transportation Noise Map does include airports, so it measures airport noises as well. And it's actually a raster data file. When you open it, you see these like eruptions of noise levels around airports. And yes, the South Burlington Airport is a center for traffic noise, so that was taken into consideration in the index.
Well, I think that was the last question, Qing.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this
Yeah, have a good
session.
night.
Thank you, you too.